This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 21st, 1972, Montana's Constitutional Convention is meeting and they are agreeing on a new state constitution that, among other things, includes a provision about a, quote, right of privacy. We'll get into the context for why this was enshrined into the Constitution. It says a lot about Montana, but also about the country as a whole in that period. And then, of course, there's the fallout of such a provision. Privacy rights have been used to establish all sorts of laws and rulings in the years since, perhaps most famously, the right to an abortion. And also, I'll just say, a constitutional convention is a super fascinating process. I will already go on the record saying there should be way more of them, if only for the theater of it all. But let's have a convention of our own here. No constitutional scholars, but just regular folks interested in history and politics, much like Montana's Constitutional Convention. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I actually want to start there with, like, why is Montana having a constitutional convention? What is a constitutional convention? It is really fascinating. And then we'll kind of wend our way towards this idea of the right of privacy enshrined in there and what that means. But, you know, I just feel like when we all hear constitutional convention, we think of the original constitutional conventions and all the founding fathers and their wigs, and it was very hot, and they're gathered in Philadelphia and they're screaming about, you know, but states can do it too. Basically, whenever they get the will together to make it happen, right?
They can and they do. State constitutional conventions are obviously much more common than federal constitutional conventions. And some states, they're constantly updating their constitutions at these so-called con-cons, constitutional conventions. And I think it's not surprising that in the late 1960s, early 1970s, people are looking around for ways to institute reforms to make government more small d democratic. It is very much a time of populist uprisings, of frustration with government. And here is something that you actually can get people together to change in a way that it can be a little harder at the federal level.
Yeah, I gotta say, I love it. I'm here for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the ways in which people want to sort of have self-determination over what they want their constitution to look like, over what they want to sort of protect or let go of. I mean, it's controversial. It's not without its contestation, but I think in some ways it's sort of like democracy at its best, getting to see how the people sort of decide these things for themselves.
And, you know, we've talked about this on the show before, but I do think, you know, late 60s into the early and mid 70s is one of those moments, and I think we're kind of in one of those right now, where people are, you know, as I like to say, kind of seeing the matrix of how government works and realizing, like, oh, the sort of structures of how we've set up our government and passing laws and voting and, you know, drawing districts and all that stuff, that has a huge effect. And, you know, maybe we should start to question some of those basic procedures. You know, I think in the 70s, people kind of took the next step and actually enacted reform in a way that maybe is not happening as much now. But it is one of those moments, and that's important to put into context. It goes beyond just kind of like, we're dissatisfied with government and there's corruption and we don't like our leaders and let's look at but it also seems to have a real particular anti-corporatist energy that I think was going throughout the country, but also there's a very Montana specific sort of element there as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is the era of Ralph Nader. People are focusing in on corporations as well as government as places of corruption. This is, what are we in, 1971, 1972? We're in 1972, which is a couple of years after Earth Day is started. The Environmental Protection Agency has just been founded. And there are real concerns in places like Montana that these industries that are operating, especially the heavy metal industries, are poisoning the environment, and that they need to be constrained in some ways by, in this case, a new constitution.
Yeah, I mean, the mineral barons have a lot of power, and I think that idea of like, a couple copper magnates get in a smoky room with a couple senators, state senators, and they hash it all out. I mean, that was kind of true. And the state constitution kind of was structured such that the executive branch didn't really have much power. There were a lot of like arcane boards and agencies that were sort of where power was weakened, and there was very little time to debate and meet and pass laws. And so, it just felt like, gosh, this thing is grinding to a halt, and all of a sudden just a few powerful people are making all the decisions in this state. And moreover, as you're saying, we don't like the outcomes. It is degrading our environment, it's degrading our economy, and so forth.
And, Montana workers that are involved in the mineral industry are really put out of the job. I mean, they're sort of the first cut when there are these, sort of international takeovers that happen in Chile, where they take over sort of the copper mine that has a huge impact on copper workers in Montana. And a lot of people lose their jobs. Companies, are laying off people left and right. And so they feel as though their work, their labor is not valued anymore. And so in a way to have control and push back on sort of like these big corporations, it's a way of saying like, hey, how can I protect my own livelihood?
It's fascinating to see how these pieces work together because, again, as we've talked about a lot on this show, this is a period of strong anti-government sentiment. But in the face of all of this corporate power, what you have are Montanans saying, actually, we need our government to be more active. We need people to meet more. We need them to have more power in order to kind of counterbalance these major forces in our state. At the same time, when they put together the Constitutional Convention, as you sort of hinted at in the introduction, Jody, they were like, no, you can't be a delegate if you're somebody who holds office. It's going to be ordinary people who are on this Constitutional Convention. The con is going to be ordinary people, and we're going to be the ones who decide what this new Constitution is going to look like and what rights it protects and preserves.
This is a sort of meta point, but it makes me think of something I've heard a number of people make. I think I've heard David Plotz say this as well, that like, he's offered what I've heard a very compelling defense of lobbying, right? He's been like, look, lobbying is what makes Washington go. This is how kind of government works, is you advocate on behalf of causes and people, and you have meetings to get things done, and you curry favor and all that stuff. And, this has the spirit of that of like, well, yeah, we want government to do all the things that government does, but we also are distrustful. I think at the end of the day, it's kind of like, if you like what they're doing, you like what the systems. And if you don't like what they're doing, you don't like the systems. But there is, there is that interesting tension here of, yeah, we want our government to get going, but we're also very distrustful, so it's not going to be a bunch of elected officials making the decisions.
It's not going to be you. Or the ordinary people kills me too, because it's like when you think of like who the ordinary people make up, it's 19 farmers and ranchers. You got your teachers, you got some bankers, some journalists, an airline pilot. You have 11 people listed as like homemakers or housewives. Like you really do have representation from sort of every single field that you can think of, and they're all coming to the table. Insurance agents, to really talk about what they want for their state.
And let's be clear, like this isn't equal representation. Those 11 homemakers make up more than half of the women who are delegates. I believe there are only 19. It doesn't say what the breakdown of race is, but it's Montana, so
Come on now.
Look.
We already know. We already know who's not at the table.
I mean, look, so we have this process of getting this convention together. So first off, it's worth pointing out, there needs to be a vote to ratify a constitutional convention. I've, lived in New York and covered New York politics for a while. We've had a couple, I think, in my lifetime where the vote hasn't even passed, and I guess in some begrudging way, you have to say, well, okay, that was the first test of popular, input here, and they didn't even want the Constitutional Convention. But it's sort of frustrating when it dies even into that kind of stage. But this does pass. There is a spirit to do it. 100 delegates are selected. There are 58 Democrats, 36 Republicans, 6 independents, but they're seated alphabetically to kind of like even it out.
I love that.
No party affiliations. Yep.
You can't sit next to your friends.
Yeah,
we're not doing it that way.
Sit to someone you don't know. Right. That's a perfect second.
They do trust falls at the beginning of each session.
Yeah, I love it. And then they start to get into it. And before we get to this right of privacy question, what else kind of works its way in to what they start to hash out?
So one of the cool things about state constitutions is, unlike the federal constitution, it's not just made up of what we call negative rights, so protections from government power. State constitutions often include positive rights, things like a right to education. And in the case of this new Montana Constitution, it includes a right to a healthful environment. This is actually something that comes up, last year? When it allowed these 16 young people in Montana to sue the state for supporting fossil fuels, saying that it violates this constitutional provision about a right to a healthful environment. The state has a positive obligation to ensure that you have a healthful environment, which is a pretty powerful thing to have put in there.
Huge.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about some of these environments or some of these cities where people are getting asthma because of the, pollution in the air, and being able to say, no, you have a responsibility to protect my health. It's major.
Yeah.
It's a high-stakes election year, so it's not enough to just follow along. You need to understand what's happening so you are fully informed come November. Every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast, our political reporters break down important stories and backstories from the campaign trail so you understand why it matters to you. Listen to the NPR Politics Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
There were a few referenda that didn't pass. There was a referenda to abolish the death penalty, and that was rejected. There was one to liberalize state gambling laws. That was approved. And a lot of this is also, talk about all these sort of quote-unquote regular folks have to get a crash course in politics, but they're making a constitution that then still has to be ratified. And so there's a lot of sort of political calculus going into this as well. And so it was like, okay, maybe the people in that room wanted to abolish the death penalty. I don't know, but that wasn't going to pass statewide. And so they need to kind of pick those provisions. But yes, the clean and healthful environment is in there. There's an acknowledgement of the state's 40,000 Native Americans, saying the state recognizes the distinct and unique cultural heritage of the American Indians and is committed to the preservation of their cultural integrity.
How many Native Americans were in the delegation? I would want to know that.
Yeah. And then you get to this question of the right of privacy. And I've been saying right of privacy instead of right to privacy, which is how I say it. I could not figure out why they said of instead of to. Maybe it's just something, but I don't know. Do either of you have a...
It sounds better to say to.
Yeah.
Freedom of right to, it feels like is the right.
But I don't know.
This is what happens when you have ordinary people.
Right. Well, or maybe it was a typo. Yeah. It was either incredibly contentious and thoughtfully argued, or it was a typo. One of the two.
They didn't have enough teachers on the delegation.
So what do we know about this right of privacy provision? Given that all this context we painted about the time, why is this kind of something that ends up being included?
It really is a concern that has started to move to the forefront of especially rights-based politics in the 1960s and early 1970s. You see the Supreme Court point to a right to privacy in 1965 when they allow married people to use contraception because they're like, you can't outlaw contraception for married people because it violates their right to privacy. That idea of a right to privacy is also part of the decision in Roe v. Wade. It is part of the conversations around sexuality and LGBTQ rights. And there's also, this is before the Pentagon Papers and the revelations of all the spying going on against Americans, but it is a period in which people are talking and thinking about wiretaps and other forms of technology that are used to spy on people. And all of those concerns are wrapped up in and sort of articulated as part of this new right to privacy.
Yeah.
This sort of boggles my mind too, because the way that they're talking about the right to privacy feels very progressive. It feels like the ways, and I'm like, Montana? Really, Montana? But in some ways, and again, it's 1973. These are different times, but there are certain elements of this that I feel like are very protective.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what I was thinking about. I'm so glad you brought that up. That this also feels like a moment where there's an inversion or a kind of interesting marrying of what you would think of as traditional kind of libertarian ideas of stay out of my business with more progressive ideas like casting abortion rights as a right to privacy. We've had constitutional scholars on the show before, but I mean, I think there's just a really interesting kind of legal framing happening in this era that has continued to obviously have impact to today.
Yeah, almost supercharged at this point in time, because those concerns about privacy and the belief that privacy should be a right, I think, has only grown since the 1970s, and it's still not enshrined in any way. And the courts can be a little all over the place with their jurisprudence on it, but it is a powerful right. And, you know, it's something that is going to open the door to protect any number of rights in Montana, because it's now enshrined in the Constitution. And once it's in the Constitution, you can interpret it in expansive ways if the state Supreme Court wants to.
Yeah. So, for instance, in 1997, the Montana Supreme Court ruled that anti-sodomy laws were unconstitutional invasions of privacy. I wonder how many of the homemakers in 1972 would have been okay with that ruling in 1997, built off the back of the words that they helped write. But, you know, there you go. That's the way that sort of legal interpretation works. And yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that, like, just like the professional constitution writers, these folks left language that, you know, and invariably is open to interpretation. I mean, the actual words in the Constitution are: the right of individual privacy is essential to the well-being of a free society and shall not be infringed without the showing of a compelling state interest. So, compelling state interest, you can just see a giant series of loopholes getting opened before everyone's eyes, right? But, you know, there you go.
Doggone language.
But there is something kind of beautiful about this. You refer to it as vague language, but it allows a constitution to remain pertinent, right? It allows it to grow along with the people and the way that their values change. And, you know, were the folks there in 1972 thinking, okay, this will allow them to enshrine abortion rights in the Constitution? Probably not. You're still a year before Roe v. Wade. Montana did not have a protected right to abortion at the time. But just last month, the right to privacy was cited by a judge who ruled that a 20-week abortion ban was unconstitutional. So he was able to point to that provision in the Constitution to protect that right.
Yeah. So coming back to this idea of the Constitutional Convention, I mean, you know, as you said, Niki, more states have done it, and there's a sort of spirit of doing this in a lot of states.
So you do have other states, a couple other states that follow along. I mean, a few years later, Louisiana also updates its constitution in 1974. And then about 10 years after that, Georgia updates its constitution in 1983. So it's, I think, in some ways compelling people to have conversations about what or how they might want to move forward politically.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that state constitutional conventions more or less end at the same point that federal constitutional amendments have largely ended in the United States. That it suggests that something fundamental has changed about the political structure and political culture of the country, so much so that people are either unable to pull together the majorities and supermajorities necessary, or are afraid to open the question of changing a constitution because it's not necessarily going to work out in your favor.
Correct. Yeah. But yes, it's such an important thing. I think it's one of the big lessons I've learned in this show is, you know, we just sort of trapped our Constitution and a lot of our systems in amber, like 40 years ago, you know, and basically haven't done much since. And I will say, you know, I like the idea of a constitutional convention, if only I like it as a kind of like a neat thing to watch play out. I mean, I remember, you know, working at WNYC, and every couple years there would be elected officials calling for a New York State Constitutional Convention to like finally, you know, address gun laws or enshrine certain rights or, you know, rework redistricting, whatever. I have my politics, but I also, just as a journalist working at a very wonky place, was like, this would be so fun to cover, right? We could do like months and months and months of coverage about all of these regular people getting together and having to learn how to write bills and all that stuff. And I just, like, as a sort of ecosystem to cover and talk about, I was very invested in wanting one. But of course, year after year, either the bill would fail or the will would not come together to do it. But
can I just say, I live in a small town that is, next year we'll be celebrating 350 years, which is bonkers to me in America. And we just had like our town hall council meeting, and it was just so, I don't know, a little special to like see how like we've been doing this for 350 years, like voting on school board or voting on like, I don't know, sanitation or what, these things that we think in some ways are like so minor in a town of like 4,000 people. But it really is cool to be a part of that process and to participate and see how like things keep, changing, but also the consistency I think is kind of cool too.
Yeah. And that's where the real power is. I mean, I think we're living in a moment where it can feel so disconnected. Politics can feel so disconnected and sort of uninvigorating. And it's like, well, no, at that town council meeting, people
the local
really
matters.
invested.
The local and the state matter.
So it's a good reminder
more
of that,
than anything
for sure.
in some cases.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's leave the state constitutional convention there, but let's do a few also on this days. This is our look at other events that happened on this day. By the way, I will say that this is what we're going to be doing a lot of in our new newsletter, which is out now, and people should go subscribe to that. You can find a sign up at thisdaypod.com. But March 21st is our day. In 1945, during World War II, this is when Allied bombers began 4 days of raids over Germany, March 21st, 1945.
And just a few years later, in 1952, the Moondog Coronation Ball, considered the first rock and roll concert, took place at Cleveland Arena.
I'm looking at the lineup for it. The Dominoes were there, but Paul Williams, Tiny Grimes, Danny Cobb, I don't recognize any of these names, but I'm sure it was a great time.
Grimes has been in the mix for so long.
Not that Grimes.
This is a tiny version.
Yeah, Tiny Grimes. Tiny Grimes is a great name for a band. My gosh.
Yeah.
And in 2006, the social media website Twitter was established with the sending of the first tweet by co-founder Jack Dorsey, who wrote, quote, "Just setting up my Twitter."
Spelled TWTTR. And I remember...
Yeah, no vowels.
I didn't... Yeah, no, vowels were very out in the early
You have
2000s.
to buy vowels.
Yeah.
It's expensive.
There you go. I remember in the early days of Twitter, I didn't join that early, but I remember in the early days of Twitter, everyone's complaint was like, oh, what do I want to do on this? People are just posting like what they're eating for lunch or making stupid jokes. And now I'm like, oh, what I would do for a Twitter where people were just posting what they ate for lunch and making silly jokes.
I know. Please, let's go back. You can have your vowels, please.
We'll give them to you for free.
Yeah, I know.
And then a year later, 2007, Vice President Al Gore comes back to Congress and he pleads with House and Senate committees to fight global warming. Skeptical Republicans questioned the science behind his documentary, which had just come out, An Inconvenient Truth. And I will just say, I think An Inconvenient Truth is just a really fascinating... I mean, I'm always pitching ideas and thinking of stories. I've actually talked to the folks at Slow Burn and been like, you should do a Slow Burn, An Inconvenient Truth. Like, I just think that as a really interesting phenomenon, and the way Al Gore was just sort of sidelined or just not paid attention to.
Listen, the polar bear scene gets me every time.
Yeah.
Every single time.
Yeah, well, almost 20 years ago. And how much have we done since? But yeah, I just think it's a really fascinating moment. We should do an episode where we just kind of dig into that documentary and the response to it, for sure.
Love that.
All right, I'm taking that idea back from anyone else I was pitching it to. We're going to do it.
Dibs. That's how it works in podcasting.
Exactly. That is how it works in podcasting. All right. Well, we are at the end of this podcast episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.